The Federal Reserve System is the third central banking system in the United States history. The first Bank of the United States, 1791 to 1811, and the second Bank of the United States, 1817 to 1836, each had a 20-year charter. Both banks issued currency, made commercial loans, accepted deposits, purchased securities, maintained multiple branches, and acted as fiscal agents of the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. federal government was required to purchase 20% of the bank's capital stock and to appoint 20% of the board members or directors of each of these first two banks. Therefore, each bank's majority control was placed squarely in the hands of wealthy investors who purchased the remaining 80% of the stock. These banks were opposed by state-chartered banks who saw them as very large competitors, and by many who insisted that they were in reality banking cartels, compelling the common man to maintain and support them. President Andrew Jackson vetoed legislation to renew the Second Bank of the United States, starting a period of free banking. Jackson staked the legislative success of his second presidential term on the issue of central banking. Quote, "Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people." Jackson's second term in office ended in 1837 without the Second Bank of the United States charter being renewed. In 1863, as a means to help finance the Civil War, a system of national banks was instituted by the National Currency Act. The banks each had the power to issue standardized national banknotes based on the United States bonds held by the bank. The act was totally revised in 1864 and later renamed the National Bank Act. The National Banking Act, as it is popularly known, the administration of the new national banking system was vested in the newly created office of the Comptroller of the Currency and its chief administrator, the Comptroller of the Currency. The office, which still exists today, examines and supervises all banks chartered nationally and is a part of the United States Treasury Department. The fundamental difference between all the previous incarnations of nationalized banking entities and the current Federal Reserve System is that the Federal Reserve is a wholly owned, separate banking cartel that has no federal government or American citizen ownership or oversight. It is a secret held within a mystery that creates money out of thin air and the actual monetary value of the common currency one uses daily. If one was to try to put a modern outlook on how the Federal Reserve System came into being and what it creates, imagine if Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and George Soros got together in secret on an island somewhere and decided that the American dollar henceforth would now be conducted with Bitcoin. That's basically what was done on Jekyll Island in Georgia in 1913. The beginnings of the 20th century saw great changes take place within the United States. In the closing years of the 1800s, 1898 to 1899, America was involved in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, Cuba, and Spain. And the American public was hoodwinked into the war cry of "Remember the Maine," as a result of the American ship the Maine being blown up by the Spanish in Havana Harbor. However, history and research has shown that the ship blew up as a result of faulty storage of munitions by the crew, and the Spanish, then the colonial governors of Cuba, had nothing to do with it exploding. The supposed hero of this conflict was Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, who used the success of his war in his Charge of the Light Brigade on San Juan Hill in Cuba to propel himself politically to first governor of Ohio and then into the White House in 1904. He served 2 terms as Republican and became disillusioned with the Republican Party and began the Progressive Party, and attempted a 3rd term in 1912, but was defeated by the Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's administration is historically known for 2 things. Number 1, involving America in its first foreign conflict in World War I, and 2, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Young men in vast numbers were sent off to war in Europe to fight the First World War. This was the first time ever that the United States had took part in an armed conflict that did not directly affect the United States. There were many people in our country that were vehemently opposed to this action, as that prior to this, the United States had always followed the doctrines set forth by our founding fathers that promoted the notion that international affairs, and wars in particular, were the problems and troubles of those countries involved, and we, as the United States, should remain outside of any conflict that did not directly affect us. The Civil War had shown the American people just how destructive and cruel war is, and most level-headed people wanted nothing at all to do with the war, let alone a war that was thousands of miles away and was spawned by a conflict between Prussia, Germany, England, and France. But enter the war we did, and as a result of that involvement, our economy was in dire straits as a result of the loans the government had to take out to pay for the war. Then, in the spring of 1912, a group of financiers consisting of representatives of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, and the Rothschild family gathered together in secret on Jekyll Island in Georgia and crafted what became the Federal Reserve Act and created the credit-based system our monetary system works under. Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law in 1913. Prior to this, the United States had created its own money, and that money was backed by gold. The U.S. Mint was in fact a U.S. Mint. You could walk into any bank in America and with a $1 bill demand to have the equivalent value given to you in gold. These were known as gold certificates and were our common currency until President Nixon took us off the gold standard in 1970. With the creation of the Federal Reserve, the United States government gave away their right to create their own money. The money you hold in your pocket right at this very moment is nothing more than a debt certificate. Our Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, clearly lays out the process by which we, as the United States, are to coin money. The Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. This process, and the right for us to coin our own money, all went out the window with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. What most people are unaware of, though, is the fact that it was these same financial manipulators that got us involved in the First World War and were responsible for providing the loans needed to the government to pay for that war. The first income tax was a direct result of all of this, and that income is the profits generated by corporations, not the wages earned by your average citizen. And the income tax revenue levied against the war was to be a short-term measure for only 18 months to generate revenue to pay off the war debt. But the financiers of those loans had no desire whatsoever of allowing the American government to ever get out from under the debt that they had incurred, and the creation of the Federal Reserve Act would ensure that they never did get out of debt, because they would always be borrowing money from the Federal Reserve as opposed to coining their own money. The Federal Reserve loans money to the U.S. government, with interest of course, and the government doles this money out to the various banks across the country through the distribution outpost it has located in different districts around the country. This money is not backed by gold, it's not backed by silver, it's not even backed by lead. It's backed by thin air and numbers created on a spreadsheet somewhere. In 1919, President Wilson severely chided himself for his decision to sign that particular piece of legislation and said publicly, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion of a small group of dominant men."